Good afternoon all, and thank you for joining me. My name's Gwinnett. As of 2.5 weeks ago, I am now formally of the Metropolitan Police Service, but still very much in contact with them. So quick bit of context around kind of how I came to this presentation. So I spent 4 years as the chief architect on a major agile engineering program as part of a fairly classic enterprise in public sector. So leading a large number of product development teams and effectively running through and applying enterprise architecture practices in that agile delivery context. I then had the privilege to move and work for the Met, who had a very classic enterprise architecture model embedded within their IT function, reporting into the CIO, that had its standards and patterns and that structure of context, but was a little bit further removed from some of the application delivery aspects. And so what I did was take some of the lessons that I'd learned as part of heading up that agile engineering program and started to applying them in that broader enterprise project delivery and kind of enterprise integration context. And some of those things worked particularly well, which I wanted to just kind of share with you my experience, and other things less well, so I don't mention those because that's generally easiest. So I thought I'd start by defining effectively how I'd categorize a digital enterprise these days, as opposed to your kind of classic enterprise construct. So I worked in enterprises for nearly 20 years, and from that classic model where technology was broadly static, so effectively heavy outsourcing, major technological change tended to occur as part of those commercial transitions and as part of big structured projects that took months, if not years, to complete. So you'd have a kind of a small portfolio, smallish portfolio, very large changes going through. But change was manageable and planned, rather kind of lean being applied to look for efficiencies. And effectively, therefore, in an enterprise architecture context, you could model, map things out, kind of really do a lot of that piece of delivering strategies, policies, and those great enterprise architecture constructs, a kind of very Togafian supportive model that effectively supports that kind of change activity because people have time to engage and time to have those discussions. Then very much we went through a digital transformation, the organization I was at the time, and we introduced wholesale new ways of working. This applied across procurement, certainly project and technology delivery, but also into all of the other supporting functions, and enterprise architecture was part of that. And we went from having dozens of large projects to potentially hundreds of small projects being run by dozens of different teams who were all kind of empowered and very much running under their own steam, kind of setting their own priorities, taking their own approaches and looking for what worked for them. Lots of innovation occurring kind of outside of formal project mandates, and transformation was absolutely wholesale. As I say, it touched every aspect of the business. And what we found was that some of those classic enterprise architecture approaches frankly just weren't responsive enough. The teams weren't able to engage with them in that way. You'd give them a set of patterns and standards and kind of that strategic element to walk through, and as soon as you found out that it was more kind of effectively a 10-page Word document, teams would kind of disengage with it because they'd have delivery pressures. They'd be working on things that just needed to be driven forward. So in moving that model where change is an absolute constant, it didn't devalue enterprise architecture. If anything, actually became more important. And I think the organization's senior management were really cognizant of the fact that actually it was more essential than ever. We just had to change the way that we delivered it and effectively change the way that we interacted with those teams. So to do that, we basically adopted a number of the agile engineering practices and put them into an enterprise architecture context to help people kind of coordinate it and introduce those ideas and those structures to teams that were used to being far more autonomous. And I think the main thing that we kind of derived from that was that enterprise architecture's sole purpose around that was kind of championing business value, but also acting as that point of coordination and consolidation. So this was kind of became the phrase that I used to sum up our entire approach to agile architecture in that context, which was keeping one eye on the horizon. So effectively, the enterprise architecture team became responsible for understanding where the organization was trying to go, what they were trying to deliver, and what was valuable about that. So we introduced this concept, which has become quite popular, in just enough design up front. GDUF, it's a horrible acronym, but does work quite well as a concept. And effectively, that can end up being quite a lot of design. The bigger and more ambitious your landscape and your transformation, the more materials you give. But effectively, it gives those teams the context boundaries and the horizon point that they can arrange themselves around. So if you've got a dozen teams, you can't necessarily engage with all of them equally. But if you can set that clear vision and give them those guide rails, they can go off and do their discovery and do their delivery, confident that they're aligned to the point they're trying to get to. So effectively, from an enterprise architecture perspective, we went to producing our first assertions and our first sketches of models and patterns that we were going to deliver in a matter of days, where we might previously spend months doing stakeholder engagement and elicitation. Effectively, if it took more than 3 days for the first version, somebody senior would be quite upset with us. We test that through working with it in the teams, and we iterated the designs and the ambitions constantly, but we ran very strict change control. So nothing got implemented into beta or production systems until it had been through full governance and scrutiny. But effectively, the design was constantly evolving in the background, so the teams could see that feedback was being taken on board and we were adapting these things. The primary questions that enterprise architecture sought to answer was giving teams the view of where's the horizon they were trying to get to, what was the thing they need to be cognizant of. That could cover simple things like scaling. So effectively, for some of our systems, we went from having a user base of 1,000 users to a user base of 100,000 users. And that's not something that scales gracefully. So one of our key aspects was working with the service owners to help them understand whether the solutions or the prototypes they've been built could evolve into that fully scaled solution, or effectively whether one of the aspects of that was effectively that was disposable to prove the model, to prove out the design, and that you then had to build something else. And what we found that a lot of those dialogues were happening, but certainly the first few times that service owners encountered a fact where they had to kind of dispose of a product to then build the scaled version, that came as quite a shock. They hadn't quite had that cognizant and explicit dialogue around the fact that the solution they built wasn't the final result. And so effectively what we did through the EA practice was drive in all of those. We also used to jestingly refer to it as the hive mind, because the main thing the EA function did was also to cover it across all of those different delivery teams. So effectively a very small function could kind of scale and handle that coordination and consolidation between more than a dozen different teams, and effectively providing that kind of consistency and scaled view. And that was really valuable. And I think that's the thing that a lot of the kind of scrum masters, delivery managers, and others kind of really latched onto in terms of the advantages. And when I kind of took that into the Met, it's something that, again, project managers, program managers, and those senior business stakeholders, the kind of budget holders and SROs for those big programs, really recognize the value of them not having to do all of that engagement themselves, and to have that kind of coordinating function. And also the fact they could see rapid iterations and that we were able to be responsive to changes in their context and to changes in their dynamic. So a tactic that I used, lifted straight from Agile engineering, that I introduced, and I've introduced in 3 or 4 different organizations now, is the adoption of personas for enterprise characteristics for services. So Agile delivery teams and certainly digital transformation services tend to be very good at developing personas for their end users, occasionally for the kind of system operations function, some of the service and kind of customer interaction. What they don't tend to necessarily gravitate as much towards is some of the more of the non-functional aspects. So security is a great one around this, but also some of the elements around supportability, maintainability, and the other things you need for an enterprise-grade service. Effectively, what I did as part of the EA practice was we introduced a set of personas to help round out the understanding of services. So we always had a supportability persona, which effectively talked about the organization's ability to operate and to run that service once it was delivered. And effectively what you would do is assign that persona, and you'd start to feed it into the user stories, use cases, and requirements that were being derived through those teams to talk about how you're going to respond in the event of an outage, kind of who's responsible for taking that forward, and start to map out and do that kind of service architecture aspect, which has been a newer introduction to the EA landscape, but I think is really valuable in terms of understanding that support and response model. I also like to introduce a number of anti-personas to talk about people using the system not in a way that it's intended. So again, with a lot of agile engineering practice, they tend to do a lot of happy path modeling. So to understand how people would like to use the system and how it should be utilized, and don't necessarily look at people using it kind of willfully incorrectly. And again, that's where I tend to tease in a lot of the security aspects is around, and I tend to have like an anti-fraud persona as an example for people attempting to manipulate the system deliberately in order to try and draw out assets or resources they shouldn't be given access to. I found that persona model really helped people latch onto it. It gave them a way of identifying with the problem space and kind of abstracted away from some of the kind of personalities within the organization, but also the idea you could end up with generic user stories that said things like, as the system, I wish to be monitorable. And I think it just made it a little bit impersonal, and people tended to deprioritize some of those characteristics. Which I thought was a bit of a weakness. And so again, we started to kind of manifest it around those personas. I've used it for a lot of aspects now of that enterprise journey and that enterprise capability. So I tend to have kind of a library of a dozen that I will kind of trot out and introduce to projects as we go through to go with their baseline requirement set. It's worked pretty neatly, frankly. I quite like it as a model. We're always evolving them and updating them. And indeed, the team, after I left, kind of announced the latest iteration of the library and ran it through with me, which was really welcome. But yeah, it's one of those areas where I think it's great how powerful those can be. And again, from an enterprise architect point of view, certainly if you're doing kind of complex application delivery or application refresh, that persona model can really help people engage with it. So it can be a fantastic communications tool for people to just understand effectively who they're delivering this for, what the considerations are, and some of those, like I say, that broader enterprise context about what it means to actually operate that service, because things spend far more time being run than they do being built. Governance. It's enterprise architecture, and certainly I'm a long-standing enterprise architect, so I have to talk about governance. But governance is a good thing. And I think one of the challenges that I had, certainly with kind of agile delivery projects, is that governance was so often seen as a blocker or a barrier to actually delivering change. So one of the things that I normally spend a lot of time doing is going back and explaining to people in the delivery community, but also senior business stakeholders and kind of the C-suite level about why that governance existed, what the purpose it delivered for the organization, effectively how it was supposed to be focused on removing duplication of effort, enhancing value, focusing actual delivery around the key priorities. So I used to do a lot of work with things like benefits dependency networks and the strategy to show how change work was delivering key enablers for the business and where the business was trying to get to. And I think so often the role of governance, and certainly governance forums, had been lost in that concept, that it became kind of a barrier or a hoop you had to jump through to get something actually done, without realizing that the reason that existed was to effectively make sure you were doing the right things and doing them in a way that was suitable for the organization. So there was an awful lot about reinforcing that dialogue. Just focusing in on that value. But effectively, I took 3 core principles, and these have followed me around for quite some time, in order to kind of go back and review how our structures were working and whether they were delivering for us the value that we wanted. So first and foremost, decision making should occur at the lowest effective point. There is a tendency in large organizations to move key decisions, so things like go or no go decisions, kind of up the tree, as it were, and move them to very senior management. There's a danger with that, in that the individuals making the decision are far more removed from the impact of the change that the change is going to have. And also those people tend to be massively over allocated in terms of kind of availability and the responsiveness they've got. So it's really important to kind of push your decision making down to what you think the lowest effective point is. We tend to have a lot of really useful discussion around what being effective means. So if you think you'll make a decision and then a more senior body will immediately overturn it, that's not an effective point. But effectively, you should always aim to drive that down closer to the people that have to live with the consequences of the change you're making, because they have a real vested interest in making sure it works in the best way possible. Quite perversely, compared to some of the modeling that we used to do, I'm a big fan of leaving actual decisions till the last responsible moment, effectively because you're always learning, the context is always evolving, you're always getting feedback that you should respond to, and the earlier you lock in a decision, the less likely it is, I think, that the end result will be what you need it to do. So what you need to really work out and spend a lot of your time focusing on is certainly around things like a design or a pattern or a standard. What's the last moment that you can do that at, after which it starts to have a detrimental effect in terms of generating waste, or causing confusion within the delivery structures. Really focusing in on those moments of saying, it's not appropriate to decide that now. We need to decide that, but actually the appropriate time is to do that in a couple of weeks, in a couple of months, and to have those discussions, because it teases out for stakeholders where that key decision point is and what the critical dates actually are versus the kind of milestones and delivery plan. And then the other thing is to make decision-making responsive to the pressures of that digital transformation. It tends to be a high cadence, kind of rapid heartbeat process that you're going through. And so often, certainly if you have things like monthly design reviews or technical design authorities, etc., people feel they spend more time waiting to get a decision and in order to get that feedback than they do actually getting the value out of what the feedback is. So effectively, as a start for that, I'm a big fan of the goal. If any of you have kind of read it, which is kind of the story around introducing agile processes. Well, that was in a manufacturing context with the concept of halve your batch size. So effectively, what I did was double the frequency of governance sessions, like all of them. If they happened fortnightly, they became weekly. If they happened monthly, they became fortnightly, etc. And halve the duration. So we went from having a 90-minute meeting every month, as an example, to a 45-minute meeting every 2 weeks. And effectively, that means that nobody's ever waiting long for feedback or for a decision. And because the sessions are shorter, they also have to be far more focused in terms of what they come to you with and ask. So you allow them to kind of schedule themselves in, but you kind of go, you can talk to us for no more than 10 minutes. And if you're aiming to get a decision at the end of it, you have to make sure those are the pertinent ones. We can't have like 10 minutes of background and then 30 minutes of discourse. And again, I think that breeds the right behaviors in the delivery teams, but also really focuses you from that EA point of view on what the key value points are in terms of supporting the decision. So rather than having discussion in order to understand all of the context, which you should do before the governance session, it really focuses you on what are the key value points, what are the key decision points and risk points for the organization, because those are the things we need to address as part of the session itself. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of your governance, it should be frequent, it should be conversational, it should be a dialogue, because people respond to that far better. And if you're more seen as to be kind of policing or kind of governing that structure, I used to refer to it as being Caesar's thumb, where people would come along and hoping they get the yes or the no to proceed. If they feel it's that kind of barrier, A, they'll avoid having the conversation until the last possible moment, and B, there'll be a huge amount of delivery pressure mounting behind it to kind of compel you to agree to take things through you might otherwise be a little bit uncomfortable with. By making it more conversational and more supportive through the dialogue, you'll get people to engage far easier, and then you'll be able to intercept things and help kind of do course corrections where needed much earlier in the life cycle. And in software delivery, that's absolutely essential. A slightly more contentious area is governance of innovation. You really need to do some governance of innovation, simply because there are too many brilliant ideas and too many tools that you could use, and not enough time or money in all of the world to do those things. So I used to use this kind of a small group with a mixture of disciplines to kind of understand the whole, whether it was worth us pursuing a thing. And that would either be a concept that somebody wanted to do, an exploratory app in relation to, as an example, or adoption of a new technology. And effectively we triage it, and everything was marked as one of the 3 N's for us. So now, not yet, or never, where you would basically say, yes, this is absolutely a thing of value and we should explore it and we should start on it. Or you would say, this is something potentially of value, but now's not the right time for us to do this. We have other priorities or other pressures, but actually we should come back and revisit this in 3 months' time. Or never. And actually quite often the answer was, we don't think this is right for our organization. It doesn't fit with our vision. It doesn't fit with the purpose of the organization. Or actually, given the pressures that we've got on the moment, whilst it sounds very interesting, it's not delivering us something that's essential now. And a lot of these other things that we're doing will. The main purpose of those sessions is to work out what the business value is. I always come back to this, that enterprise architecture should be focused around the context of what delivers value for the organization in what it's trying to deliver in achieving its mission and kind of fulfilling that core purpose of the organization and the kind of why your organization exists. And it's not just going, could I implement this as a technology? So effectively, what we used to do from that was not only agree things to go forward, but also set the success criteria for those innovation projects, which would be focused around the value the organization could derive from it and getting that quantifiable as much as possible. So effectively what you'd say is, we believe this can save X amount of staff time. As an example, we believe it'll help accelerate our responsiveness. Therefore, your success measures will be, well, then you've managed to gain X amount of efficiencies in terms of people processing things. That's a nice, easy one. People would talk about a lot around, we did a lot of work with kind of AI and machine learning in data analytics, where we believed it would derive us greater insight. And actually, we used to map that back into business criteria of ability to make decisions in a more informed or more responsive manner. So can you make a decision faster, or does the decision taker feel more confident in the decision they're making because you reinforced it with the data? And how quickly can you get to that position? Because otherwise it's an area you can kind of innovate on forever, which is quite good fun. Portfolio management. Portfolio management's an undervalued part of enterprise architecture, in my view, and tends to get kind of sidelined a lot into kind of delivery structures. I've always thought it's really essential, and I just like this kind of quote as a way of summing up why I think it's important. When you get into diverse delivery organizations, certainly the larger organization, the more delivery teams you have running within it, the harder it will be for them to coordinate between themselves. If you do things like Scrum delivery, people talk about the Scrum of Scrums, and there's lots of concepts around things like the architecture runway in the scaled Agile framework, which all starts trying to address some of these. But fundamentally, you get to the stage where to do the communication, to do the interaction between delivery teams takes people away from doing what they think their core delivery purpose is, and the core things they should be focusing on. As a result of that, they tend to avoid doing so. So they will occasionally miss the fact that technology or services are already available for reuse within the organization. You will find that you might have the same type of capability implemented with 2 or 3 different technologies, which gives you a service and operations overhead of running them all. So effectively, we did a huge amount of work within the portfolio of getting distilled information down about what was valuable, which was mostly focused around how easy is a thing to consume as a service, how easy is it for you to use it as a component or an element within your overarching capability delivery. And that moved us away from lengthy documentation and kind of high-level designs to bounded context maps, which I'm a huge fan of in terms of expressing the capability of systems and services, but domain models fundamentally, and a lot of wiki pages. So effectively things with distilled, rapidly consumable information being available, and then with links out to further detail if they need it, if they decide to go ahead and implement. But your main purpose around that portfolio management piece is to help people navigate that big, diverse landscape in as quickly and as short a time as possible, effectively, and understanding why it's valuable to do so. So in conclusion, for your enterprise architecture practice, when doing major digital transformation and application delivery, increase your responsiveness, absolutely focus on context and making sure other people understand that. And you have to communicate relentlessly. And it also helps if you talk quite fast.